In this video, I'll be discussing setting this architectural interior scene up in a night configuration. This is a still frame render and basically a continuation of the architectural interior daylight video. I do recommend that you watch that video prior to starting this one because some of the concepts and information discussed in that video are useful to this particular video as well. That being said, I'll just go ahead and jump in here and get started on this scene. The first thing that I want to do is I will be using mental ray for this scene, so I'm just going to switch my renderer over from scanline to mental ray. Let's close that for now. And if I back out of the scene here, you'll see that there's no lights in the scene. I have this yellow geometry. That's not a light, that's actual geometry that's up here. I'll talk about that in just a second. But what I'll do first is start adding some lights to the scene. I don't have to worry about a daylight system because again this is a night scene. So what I'm just going to do is add some photometric lights here. And I'm just going to add a free light. Now when you first click on it, you're going to get this little prompt to asking you if you want to use exposure control, which I do, so I'm just going to say yes. You can disable that message if you get tired of seeing it every time you create a light source, by the way. I'll leave it on just for these videos. I'll just drag that kind of center of this light fixture. Need to switch to a viewport and move this up on the Z-axis or Y-axis here and move this into place. And I want it just below this light surface, this light fixture. And what I'm going to do is assign an IES profile to this photometric light. To do that, one, I just want to make sure that ray trace shadows are enabled so that I have some shadows here. But for the light distribution type, I'm just going to change that to photometric web and scroll here to the distribution of photometric web and just need to go find an IES profile. These are some that I've downloaded. You can find them on the internet. 3ds Max ships with some, so you should have some of these in your default installation folder somewhere. But I'm just going to grab some of these. I'm just going to grab this IES, this first one here. And you can kind of get a preview of what the IES profile is going to look like in the light, as well as the light source itself. You see it changes the way this light looks, this icon. I'm going to scroll down and set a color for this light. I could use some of the preset colors here. For example, if I wanted a halogen light, either cool or warm, I could specify that. I find it easier to specify my own colors so that I can adjust the exposure easy the way that I want it to look. So I'm just going to set this for kind of a Kelvin temperature, which is 2800 to 3200, somewhere in that range. So I'm just going to set this up for I'm just going to say 3200. I don't need to change any of the intensities or anything else with this light source right now because it's using that photometric profile, which if it comes from a light manufacturer, you have to assume that it's correct, physically correct for a particular light bulb or light fixture. So you don't need to go in and change any of the intensity values here. So I'm just going to drag this over as an instance copy, holding the left mouse button down and dragging. I get this clone option box. I'm just going to select instance and just move this into place. That's pretty good the way it is. And do this again, instance copy. Okay, I want to go in and make some more copies of this, so I'm going to switch to my selection filter here. I'm going to change over to lights and just drag a selection around those and shift copy instance copy over here. Drag that into place like so. And then I have two more copies to make for the lights here beside the television set. Again, shift drag, instance copy, and then just zoom in to put these in place. You could also use the align tool if you wanted to set these up. These are kind of grouped objects, so I could have used the align tool there, but it's probably just as quick for me to put these into place. Okay, next I'm going to go back to my camera viewport here, and I want to enable hardware shading and make sure it's set up to use the scene lights instead of the default lights. And next I need to adjust the exposure control, although that looks pretty good the way it is. I think I'll leave that the way that it is because that's fairly good, because if you remember when I added that first light, it asked for the exposure control. It already configured it for kind of a good value for these photometric lights, so I can just leave that the way it is. Now I did notice that some of the settings in my exposure control were the same from the previous tutorial on the daylight version of this scene, so I'm just going to set these back to the default values. I think that's the same. Okay, so that should be the default values that you have listed in your scene if you're starting from scratch. So during the testing phase and setup phase, I just need to decrease the render resolution. I'm just going to use, let's say, 450 and check my render settings. Yeah, that's good. You want to use kind of a medium or low image precision setting here. Let me just clear this out, because you don't want to wait a long time for these test renders to come through. And also I like to use a material override instead of using my actual materials to calculate the lighting and to kind of get a preview of the lighting. What I like to do is use this material override. So I'll enable that and then open up my material editor and then select, I have to assign what type of material I want to override all the objects in the scene. As I mentioned in the daylight video, this doesn't physically replace the materials that I have assigned to my objects. This is a render time action that happens, and it will override the materials that I have in the objects, but it's not actually going to go in and replace any materials that I've assigned. So I want to use an Arc and Design material, and I'm just going to drag that as an instance copy over to my viewport, over to my material editor here. And I just want to adjust some of the settings. I want the color to be kind of a off-white. Just change that, and that's just a personal taste. You can set it any color that you want. I don't want any color contribution, any color bleeding or color bouncing. That's why I use kind of a neutral color here. For reflectivity, I'm going to tone that down, the amount of reflectivity, and instead of having glossy reflections or just regular ray trace reflections, I don't want to have to wait for that, so I'm just going to use this highlights and FG only mode, and then dial down the glossiness value like so, and that's ready to go. So what I could do now is just go ahead and render out a preview of this scene so I can just kind of get a feel for how the lighting and the exposure look at this point. And obviously it's a tad on the bright side, so I just need to go in and adjust my exposure control. Maybe bump this up to something like 4. And also I have some hot spots here in the scene. I want to dial those down, so I'm going to decrease the burn value here to, let's say, 0.05. And if you also note, there's that strong yellow or gold tint to the light here. I can tune that out with the exposure control settings, because here I've assigned, I know what my Kelvin value is of these light sources, so I can tune that out using the Kelvin value on the white point. For example, if I set that to 3200, that will neutralize the color of this light source in my render, and so by matching those, I should get more of a white light source. So as you can see, that got rid of that orange, that strong gold tone to the room. Again, that just by balancing that exposure control, I'm not changing anything with the light controls here. I'm just controlling the actual color via this white point in my exposure control settings. So I probably want just a little bit of warmness to those lights, so I'm going to increase this to, let's say, 3600. And I still have some bright over bright areas, burnt light areas here. I'm just going to decrease this burn value a little bit further. Try that. Okay, that looks pretty good the way it is. One thing that I want to do with with these photometric lights is they're currently set up as point lights, meaning that they give you these hard shadows, non-area shadows, if you will. I want this to be soft because it's a night render. So what I'm going to do is just change this to disk, which is going to make these area lights. Let me just close this down. And I want to size these about the same dimension as the light fixture. So I'm going to go back into my top viewport here. And I'm just going to decrease the size of that radius, which is currently set for 5 inches, 5.5. I'm just going to decrease that down to, let's make it a little bit larger, let's say 2.5 inches. Now by doing so, making these area lights, it's going to slow down the render because it has to calculate the area samples, which by default is set to 32. But it will give you the soft illumination that there are the soft shadows that should make the scene look a little bit better. Okay, so now I'm ready to move to the or start changing and adjusting these final gather settings here. Right now I'm just using final gather. I'm not using global illumination, so I'm just using one mode of indirect illumination here, final gather. I'll need to add some bounces here to give this scene a little more realistic light bounce. Again, same as in the daylight discussion on this, I need somewhere between 4 and 7 bounces, which is the recommendation here. If you move over and hover over this with your mouse, you'll get this little tooltip that gives you some information on that and recommends using 4 to 7 bounces. So I'm just going to set this to 5. And also I need to adjust the trace depth setting because I'm limiting the number of bounces here on the reflection side to 2. So I need to change that to 5. And 2 is the default value. So I'm just going to make all of these 5. And I'll also want to increase the quality a little bit here, so I'm just going to set this to low. And let's just see what that looks like. Okay, that looks pretty good. I don't have a lot of intricate detail here, like in the creases and things like that. So I could either increase the final gather settings, or I could use ambient occlusion to bring out some of those details that are lost. And I'm going to use ambient occlusion on my textures rather than increase this final gather setting. I say that I will actually increase the final gather to the medium preset, but even then I know that I won't have a lot of details in here, just because Mental Ray tends to provide a more soft indirect illumination solution. So to get a preview of what my materials will look like with ambient occlusion, I'm just going to enable that on this test material here. And let me put this back at medium, or at low. And I'll say that I'll increase it to medium just because you can kind of see a little bit of a white spot here, and there's just a couple of little areas that need a little more detail. So for my final render, I know that I'm going to increase that to the medium preset, and that should be fine for this particular scene when used with that ambient occlusion to bring out some of the detail, flesh out some of that edge detail. Okay, the next thing that I want to look at is this little light shelf area here at the top. What I'll have is some strip lighting in this area. And what I want to do is go ahead and set that up. So let me just close this. And I'm actually just going to go in and hide the furniture layer for now, just so that I can move around a little quicker in the viewports. My viewport's a little bit slow, especially because I'm recording video on top of this, so that'll help speed things up here. So probably the first thing that you would think to do for an area like this would be to add some photometric lights in here. Let me come in and disable hardware shading for now, so that we get a better view of the room here. So you may think I'll just add some photometric lights in here to simulate the shelf lighting. So what I'll do is just create a photometric light here. And I know that these little yellow areas are are the size of the photometric lights that I need. That's kind of one of the reasons that I put those there. Another reason I'll show you in just a second, but I'm just going to create a free light, and I'll set this up for and to be an area light. Let's make this a rectangle, and I want to size it similar to the size of these yellow objects that you see here, this geometry. Something like so. And kind of put this in place. Okay. Let me just move this in the top viewport now. Now, by default, this is set up for uniform spherical distribution type, and I want to change that to diffuse so that I'm only emitting light in one direction here, because I don't really need to emit light in all directions in this particular case. So let me just move that into place, and I'm just going to rotate this around 180 degrees as an instance copy, and drag this over to the other side like so, and then make another copy. I'm only going to rotate this one 90 degrees, and I'm going to make this a copy because obviously I need to change the dimensions here, the width, because it's too wide for that shelf. Bring it in like so, and then make an instance copy of this light and rotate it 180 degrees. Put it in place here, and let's just set these up for well, one, let's change the intensity here. The default value of 1500 is too strong for these particular lights. I'm going to decrease that to, let's say, well, let's make this one 300 and these longer ones 600. Just because the longer light here, the larger this light source is, the more powerful it has to be in comparison to the smaller light source. So to get kind of an even amount of light, this one's roughly half the length of this. So that's why I put roughly half the intensity on these. I don't have an IES profile for this, so I'm just kind of guesstimating at the strength on these. Same way with the Kelvin color. I'm going to lower this down to 2800 because I want a nice golden color from these lights. Okay, and what I'll do for the testing here is I'm just going to disable Final Gather, and I'm going to turn off these other lights, these other photometric lights that I have in the scene. Let me just disable these. And that's just so I can focus on this particular area here without having to worry about lighting calculations and waiting for the render. So let's just give this a test render. Okay, so immediately you notice that we have these hot spots. The reason for this is that this photometric calculation, this light calculation, is actually calculated from point data. Even though I have this set up as a rectangle light source, area light source, it's still calculated from that center point of that light source. So you'll get this hot spot in the middle, when in reality what I wanted was an even light distribution across the entire face of that light source. And it doesn't matter if you try switching this to something like a cylinder. I need to change the width of that. It's going to do the same thing basically. It'll give you that calculation from the center here, this hot spot. So to kind of get around that problem, what I've done is, let me delete these lights. I've created this geometry here, and I just named it Light Sim, and it's just a couple of planes that I put together and collapsed to an editable poly. And basically what they're going to do is I'm going to apply a Arc and Design material to this with the self-illumination option, And I'm going to make this glow kind of similar to, it's basically going to represent that light source. And then I'll put an actual large light here in this area shining down to illuminate the scene. But this self-illuminated material, let me just pull this up in the material editor here. You can see it's just an Arc and Design material, and in the self-illumination slot, which is currently disabled, if I enable this, you can see I have a Kelvin temperature, or color if you will, 2800 degrees, and I can set the physical units here, which is 825. And so what I'll do now is add a light source here. Now if I add a photometric light, I'll still have that center hot spot. So what I kind of prefer to do is put a sky portal light here, and I'm just going to make this a little bit larger than the opening, because I have a shelf in here. The opening is actually about this width here. So let me move this up into place, this portal light, and I'm just going to make this portal light use it as an area light. And I'm just going to put this close to the ceiling. And I need to change the direction of the light, so I'm just going to uncheck that flip light direction here, so it's pointing down into the scene. And then for the color here, what I want to do is assign a Kelvin color. So I'm just going to assign this MIB black body shader, and I have a different video on unlocking that. If you don't have that listed in your as an option, you'll need to unhide it in some of the MI files. There's a separate video on that process, so you'll need to check that out. I'm just going to drag this over as an instance copy, and I want to set the Kelvin temperature to 2800. And now for intensity, which is the brightness of this light source, I'm kind of going to just have to guess at this. Since again, I don't have a photometric value for this, I'm just going to say, let's say 750. Come back here. Let me go back to my camera view and give this a render and see what I have. Okay, that's obviously too bright, so I need to go back and decrease that. Let's say something like 350. And as you can see, I still have kind of a hot spot here in the center, but that's okay because obviously the light would be coming down from this area here, and so it would be a little bit brighter here and then fade out. But if I had used a photometric light, that hot spot would be noticeably visible, a lot stronger than what you see when you use this portal light as an area light. So let's try this again. So that's probably still just a tad bit too strong. I wouldn't expect a lot of light to come from this area, so let me try 150. And also I'm going to increase the samples here to 32 just to smooth out some of this grain, and I want it to be the same as my photometric lights, which I believe are set to 32 samples as well. Yeah, so that way when I go to use this shadow precision, if I want to use that slider, I know how much I'm increasing the quality of those area shadows. Okay, so I'll go ahead and now I'll enable these first lights that we put in, these lights with the IES profiles, and go in and enable the furniture layer again. Come back over here and enable my hardware shading and make sure it's set up for the scene lights. So now I'll give this a render and see what all the light contribution has in the scene. Went ahead and cancel that because I forgot I had Final Gather disabled, so I'm just going to set Final Gather back to draft, and I'm still using 5 FG bounces. Okay, now as I rendered this, I ran into a problem. I did not see this when I had set up the scene originally for this particular video, but now it seems as though that skylight portal is actually blocking the Final Gather from bouncing back up into this area. So if you run into something like this, like I said, I didn't encounter this the first time that I ran a dry run of this particular tutorial. If you do encounter something like this, it's really no big problem. what you can do is go in and instead of using that skylight portal, let me just delete that and go back into my top viewport, and I'll just create a photometric free light and use that instead of the skylight portal. As I had mentioned, it will produce a more warm spot or a hot spot here in the center, but since we're a decent ways away from the floor, it won't be as visible, and it'll kind of work in this particular case since we have this area that's emitting light, so it should be brighter in this area than it would be out here, so that'll actually work in this particular case. But if you can try it and get good results from it, try that portal light as an area light instead of this. But if you do run into a problem, you can always go back to this. So let me just make this like so, just a little bit larger than that molding area. Of course, I need to move this up into place like so, and then change it from this uniform spherical to uniform diffuse so that it's emitting down and not in all directions here. And for strength, I'm going to set this up for 150. And actually the good thing about this is you can see this in the viewport, whereas the portal light didn't show up too well. So what I want to do is, of course, change this Kelvin color 2800 like I did on the portal light, and what would maybe something like 80 would be about right for this. Okay, and now I'll give this a test render. Okay, that looks a lot better. Now keep in mind that if you're looking for this self-illuminated material to show up, it's not going to show up because I'm using this material override, and so everything has the same material on it. That'll show up once I turn that override off and render the final image, which I'm just about ready to do. What I want to do is go ahead and before I render the final image is use the glare shader. So I'm just going to enable the output here. You can see the glare shader is already applied. Let me just drag this over as an instance copy to the material editor, and I'm going to increase the quality of this to something like 4, and the spread maybe 1.25, and I'm going to enable streaks, say 0.75, and increase the resolution to 1000. That's all just going to give me a higher quality glare, and what that's going to do is soften these highlights and put a little bit of a glow around them, and that's going to come in handy for this overbright self-illuminated material that I've put in here to simulate that light source up here in this cove area. So what I'll do next is go ahead and increase the image precision. The shadows look kind of okay. There may be a little bit of grain. I think I'll just increase that 1 notch to 2x just to prevent any grain in the shadows here, or reduce it as much as possible. For the final gather precision, I'm going to increase that to medium. Need to change my image resolution here. I'll just go ahead and make this the same size as the render and save this out to a file. So I'm going to come in and just call this night scene. I want to tell it that it's going to read from this file, and I'll go ahead and just hit the generate so I can generate this file. And actually I need to cancel that and check to make sure that I disabled the material override, which I did not. If I would have let that process, then what it would do is obviously just calculate a indirect illumination solution based on that white material that I have applied. So make sure that you disable that. Now I need to come back to my indirect illumination and delete that little bit of calculation that it did and run this again. Okay, just to be clear, when I keep clicking this generate final gather map to create the final gather map, and then I'll do my final render. You don't have to do it in that order. You could just assign this map and then set it to read only, and then hit render. And if there is nothing in that map, if this is just an empty file name, it'll go through and it'll create that map, save the map, and then immediately start the render process using the data that it had just created and stored in that final gather map. So you don't have to click this and then click the render button to do your final render. The reason that I keep doing that is because I find it useful to create the final gather map, because I get to see that here in the viewport, and it's kind of like having a preview render to what the final render is going to look like. So before pulling the trigger on the final render, I get kind of a last chance to look this over and see if there's anything like I would want to change. For example, in this case, it's just a little bit dark for me yet, so I can go in and change the exposure settings, decrease this to lighten the scene, and I'm a little close with my Kelvin setting in the exposure control, because these lights are kind of too neutral for me. I like to have a little bit of color warmness in my light sources, so I'm going to increase this to 42, and what this is going to do is just make these appear a little more saturated in yellow or gold color. So I just wanted to clear up why I keep going to this generate final gather map button, and that's the reason why. So now I'm ready to do my final render, and I'll just go ahead and fire that off. Alright, so there's the completed image, and the glare is just a little bit, that glare effect is just a little bit too strong for this particular image. The settings that I used, I would need to go back and adjust that. I grabbed this image right before it applied the glare shader, so you could see the difference between the glare and the non-glared version. I have some noise here that I could increase the sampling on this material to decrease that noise if need be. I could also blur that out in Photoshop without having to re-render anything. Would also need to make this a little bit brighter so that the glare effect would be a little bit stronger up here on this self-illuminated material and not so much around here. One other note about this self-illuminated material that I used here, I did not have it set to illuminate the scene with Final Gather. You may want to do that, but since this material is reflective, I actually didn't need to do that, because it would just pick up the brightness of that material in the reflection and kind of look like an illumination. So again, if you want that effect, feel free to enable this option when you're using Final Gather, and it will produce a little bit of indirect illumination in your scene from those self-illuminated materials. So next, that's a setup with using Final Gather for the interior here at night. Let's take a look at this using global illumination with Final Gather, similar to what I did with the daylight version of this scene. So I'll just go ahead and pull this frame buffer up again and clear this out, and reset my image precision back to 1/4 and 4, kind of a medium setting. Reset the soft shadow precision back to 1x. I'm going to leave the reuse geometry on because I haven't changed any of the geometry. This will save you a little bit of time because it caches the geometry, and it doesn't have to translate. You don't have to wait for it to translate that geometry every time it renders. So be sure to take advantage of that option. I'm going to uncheck the Final Gather and actually delete that file. Let me go back in and check. Just want to make sure, put an eye on this and make sure that okay, yeah, it's reset here, and it's not using the Final Gather map this time. We'll actually go in and disable Final Gather, and let's close this and attack the scene using global illumination with Final Gather this time. So first thing I'll do is enable global illumination. This time, as opposite to the daylight version, I don't have to worry about focusing the photons from the mental ray sun, since there's not a daylight system here in this scene. So all the lights are already enclosed within this scene, so I don't need to worry about any focusing issues. Let me just go in and change the render size here to something like 450. And again, that's strictly a time issue. I don't want to wait for a large size render when I'm just testing the scene here, getting everything set up. So I'm just going to leave this at the default settings, and let me go in and enable that material override, just so that we can see what the photons look like without any contribution from the different colored materials in the scene. Give this a test render. And this actually looks pretty good the way that it is. I just want to bring up the mental ray message window here, make sure it's cleared out, and just render this again so that I can get a feel for how many photons are actually being generated in this scene. Even though I have it set for 20,000 average photons, I don't really know how many photons each light is contributing to the scene. So in order to get that information, I'm going to open up the mental ray message window, and you want to make sure that the information in progress options are enabled, and render this scene again. And as you can see, once it goes through and starts translating the scene, then it's going to jump into the photon emissions, and you start getting all this information about what's going on in the scene. And I'll just pause this while it renders again. Okay, so if I just scroll back up to the top here, I can see that these are actually generating about 20,000 photons each. The photometric light 09 is generating 19,000. I believe that's the one here. Yeah, that's that large center light that I put in. So in the entire scene I have about 180,000 photons, which may seem high, but in reality sometimes you can get up into the millions with photons. So that's actually a low amount, and it calculates really quickly. So I'm just going to stick with that, and what I'll do next is enable this optimize for final gather. I don't need to worry about the sampling radius or the merge nearby photons because the scene looks pretty good the way it is. The key to using when you're using global illumination is that you want a nice smooth result, and this is a fairly smooth result. So what I'll use final gather for is to kind of clean this up a bit. So in order to do that, I'll just enable final gather, and like I said, make sure you enable this optimize for final gather. Final gather is enabled, and I don't need to use a very high setting for this, so I'm just going to bump that down to low. And the diffuse bounces, you don't necessarily need to change this. Don't worry about messing with this setting when you're using global illumination, because it is ignored. The number of bounces comes from global illumination here, and right now if you think about this trace depth as the actual bounce number of photons, you get about 10 bounces with the current setup. This is the default setup. So I'm just going to leave that like it is and enable final gather and run this and see what I get. Okay, that completed render, that looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. So I'm about ready to render the final image here with this. Now I could go through and save both the global illumination map and this final gather map, and that would probably be a smart thing to do if this was an animation, or if I wanted to come in and make some changes to something later on. But since the indirect illumination calculation with the final gather and global illumination and final gather together didn't take very long, it only took about a minute for it to calculate both of those, I'm just going to let it calculate without saving that file again. So what I'll do is increase my image precision here, and also go in and increase the resolution to, let's make this 800, and of course disable the material override so that my actual materials will appear here in the scene on the final render. And that should be it. Just go ahead and give this a render now. Just move this into place. Okay, so there is the completed render using final gather along with global illumination. And again, as I mentioned in the daylight version of the scene in that video, some of the reasons that you would use the different versions, use global illumination with final gather, is that it tends to calculate a little bit faster. It's also a little bit better to use photons if you're animating the scene, which I'll discuss in more detail in a different video. But final gather is probably the quickest to set up, and that you have a minimal amount of settings to configure over using global illumination when you have to configure the GI settings sometimes along with the final gather settings. So it's really kind of, I would urge you to explore both options, but start out, probably if you're just starting out, you may want to stick with Final Gather only, and then get into photons later on. So before wrapping this up, I want to show you just one other little, it's more so of a trick than anything, to use a small light source in the scene to kind of simulate this flash photography effect that I see sometimes people post renders like this. If you want to create something like this, I'll just walk you through doing that. And what I'll do is, let me just turn off global illumination, because I'll just use Final Gather for this, and I'll leave that as it is for right now. And what I want to do is go in and disable these lights in the scene, because the scene was dark and only illuminated with that small flash light source that I had put in. So I'll just cut these lights off, disable these. Just so I can see what's going on, I may want to switch out of hardware lighting, hardware shading, and go back into illuminate with the default lights here. And just for now, so I can see how to set this up. I'll also want to disable this these self-illuminating materials here. So I'll just go back into the material editor and uncheck the self-illumination option. Okay, so in order to create this flash type of a render, what I have to do is simulate the flash from a camera. And to do that, I'll just create a really small, really bright light source. So in one of the viewports here, I'll just go in and create a new photometric light, and I'll create a free light, and I'm going to make it about the size of a flash on a camera. So I'm going to switch to rectangle, and I'll probably make it something like 2 inches by 1 inch. And for the intensity, I want this to be fairly bright, so I'm just going to set it for something around 2800 candela. Okay, and now I want to align this with my camera. So I'll go back into the top viewport here, and what I'll do is use the Align tool, and there you see the Align tool, and I'll just select the camera, and it's going to move that to the center point of that camera, and I want it to also rotate, so I'm going to hit the X-axis. And so now I don't want that light directly where the camera is. It has to be offset just a little bit, just like a camera flash on a camera is. If you have it in the exact same location, it's going to render kind of weird looking, because you won't be able to see any of the shadows because they're all going the same direction as the camera. So I'm just going to move this over about 5 inches or so, and I want to move it up as well. Again, I'm going to move this up, let's say about 6 inches. And instead of having the light, again, they default, these photometric lights default to this uniform spherical diffuse type. I want this to be a uniform diffuse, so that it's emitting light in one direction, kind of like a flash would do, if you will. Okay, and I'm going to come back to my camera view now, and let's go back into hardware shading and set this up for the scene lights. And you can see it gives kind of a blue hue here. Well, I need to change my exposure settings. So let me just scroll down and change this white point value up to 6500. And what that's going to do is eliminate that blue. I could set a specific color on that light. For example, if I wanted to set a Kelvin value of, let's make this flash 4200, and go back into exposure settings, and I want it to have a little bit of a bluish hue to it. So I'm going to change, instead of putting 4200 and getting a kind of a neutral render, I'll just say 4100 for the white point on the exposure control, and that'll give me more of a, it'll be a little bit towards the blue side, but almost perfectly white. So let me just check my exposure settings. I'm going to decrease the image precision and decrease the rendering size as well. Maybe make this 350, just to get a quick preview of what this is going to look like. I'm also going to turn off disable Final Gather, just because I want to see what the direct light is going to look like here. Okay, and that looks about right. I just may need to bump this light intensity down just a little bit. Let's say 2500, and increase the resolution here, the image precision, and also the resolution. Let's put this back to 800. And I want to go in and enable indirect illumination again. This time I'm going to decrease the multiplier though. I'm going to set this to 0.25 because as you can see with the flash, you wouldn't get a whole lot of bounce light in the room. So I just want just a little bit of bounce light. I'm actually going to decrease the bounces to 2. So there will be just a little bit of indirect illumination going on, not a lot. And the other thing that I like to do on these type renders is enable some depth of field. Because generally if you're going to walk into a pitch black room and take a picture of it, the camera's going to have a hard time focusing on something. So let me just enable just a little bit of depth of field here. I'm just dragging that over as an instance copy to the material editor so that I can modify the settings. What I want to do is check where I want the focal point to be, and I want it to be about on this table, which the camera target is about the appropriate length right now. So let me just select the camera and see what that length is. And it's set to 132 inches. I can increase or decrease that to get kind of a feel. So it looks like about 136 is what I want to use. So I'm going to plug that value into the focus plane here on this DOF and bokeh shader. And I don't want a lot of depth of field, so I'm going to decrease the radius of confusion to 0.25, and I'll just leave the samples at 4. And I believe that's ready to render, so let me just give this a render now. Alright, and there's the completed render and the result of the flashlight effect. So that's just a couple of ways to illuminate architectural interior scenes. Again, if you're just starting out with 3D Studio Max or Mental Ray, you may want to stick with the Final Gather only method of indirect illumination for your scenes, just because it's fewer settings to deal with, and then later on as you become more familiar with the package you can dive into using photons via the global illumination with Final Gather. And with that, that will conclude the video.